we are now recording, based out of White Salmon, Washington. She leads Defenders coexistence initiatives in the region, working directly with communities, sharing the landscape with imperiled species like grizzly bears and gray wolves. For the past decade, Zoë has worked to deepen human understanding of carnivore ecology and develop strategies for human-carnivore coexistence. Before joining Defenders, Zoë worked as an independent consultant in Washington, identifying opportunities to study non-lethal deterrents for gray wolf depredations on livestock and monitoring relocated beaver colonies. For her PhD dissertation, she collaborated with state wildlife agencies, ranchers, and other stakeholders in the Northwest and Rockies to forecast areas at risk for livestock depredation by gray wolves in Washington. Prior to that, she studied fisher and marten populations in California for the U.S. Forest Service, conserved rare ecological and geological resources for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and surveyed anglers' views of river otter expansion in North Dakota for the IUCN River Otter Specialist Group. Zoë has a PhD in Environmental and Natural Resource Sciences from Washington State University and a master's in Applied Ecology and Conservation Biology from Frostburg State University. With that, I'll take a deep breath. Zoë, you are lovely, and I'm so excited to introduce you and your topic, Innovating Predator-Livestock Non-Lethal Tools, Radio-Activated Guard Box 2.0. Go ahead and take it away. Thanks, Zoë.
Oh my goodness, Rosie. Thank you so much. That was certainly a mouthful, but I appreciate the intro. Hi, everybody. I'm going to work on screen sharing here for a second. Well, you can see my presentation now. Let's get it up and running. I'm just going to make sure that we
can see it.
I'm going to make sure that we can do volume 2 here. 1 second. Share sound. Great. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you this morning. As Rosie said, I'm an ecologist working with Defenders of Wildlife, and I'm going to talk to you today about a really exciting project to innovate non-lethal tools that pretty serendipitously came up last year. So to start off, I think most everybody here is familiar with the term non-lethal tool, but I'll just talk about that a little bit. So there's specific, what we call non-lethal techniques, technologies, methods, and strategies that we can use to facilitate human-wildlife coexistence. And so I work primarily in carnivore recovery and perpetuation on the landscape, reducing conflicts between carnivores and people, which as Chris just so eloquently mentioned, primarily revolves around livestock with wolves. And so these tools and techniques have been used, some of them for a few years, some of them for decades, some of them for centuries. But really, this is an opportunity both to actually reduce the number of conflicts that are occurring between predators and human interests. But there's also the value of helping to mitigate social conflicts by using these tools and techniques to show people that they can actually live with many of the large carnivores and mesocarnivores that we share the landscape with. And recently, within the past 5 years or so, there's been an emphasis on evaluating the efficacy of these non-lethal tools, techniques, and strategies. So really, a lot of these things we've been using, they've been developed. We've had them on the landscape for 10, 20 plus years, but we haven't really done that good of a job within the scientific community of looking at how well they're working and in what circumstances they're going to be most effective. So we have a ton of anecdotal evidence that shows that these tools can be effective for specific timelines and specific circumstances, but we haven't really done the deep work to figure out, to empirically investigate where and how that works. And so this is just an image from a recent study that came out in 2018 that just shows that there has been quite a few studies that have been done across the world trying to investigate the efficacy of non-lethal tools, but most of them haven't really been established beforehand to ask the question and set up a good design. They've really been like collecting data on the back end, maybe 10 or 20 years later, and then trying to put the pieces together and look after the fact at how well these things worked. And so we need to do a better job with that. And there are currently, there's not only opportunities to do better on the science side of looking at efficacy, but also to update using the latest technology for some of these non-lethal tools. As we all know, you get a new phone every year and there's some new crazy thing on there that you had no idea existed. And so technology is moving at such a pace that we have the opportunity to look at the tools that we currently have and create new and better ones, but also to create things that we hadn't even thought of before. And so here's just an example of how a non-lethal tool that we have been using for years, a Foxlight, was updated in the past few years to make it smaller, lighter, fit better on a fence post, and also incorporate a solar charging capability, which is really great. And so today I'm going to talk about rag boxes. So what are rag boxes? They are radio activated guard boxes, and they're a visual and acoustic scare device to deter predators from livestock primarily. And so you can see one of the older versions of the rag box here on the right. It's got a strobe light on top. That's the visual deterrent. It's got an old rusty speaker attached to the barbed wire fence there. That's the acoustic deterrent. And, oh, I'm sorry, I just went back, not forward. And so these were originally developed to deter predators from small livestock pastures, although we're about to look at expanding that use case. But they have to work with a radio collared predator. So you can see here's a radio collared wolf. And what happens is that wolf, there's a radio signal coming from the collar. It comes into a certain distance of this box, which picks up that radio frequency. And then the light and the sound is triggered from the box, which hopefully scares the predator away from that area. And so here's just a few videos to show you the evolution of the rag box up to date. So the first rag box really came out in the late 1990s, and that's the one that you can see here. And so you can see that strobe light I just showed you on the top. It actually had to have a separate antenna to pick up the radio frequency from the wolf, and then the speaker attached to it. And then here's a newer version that started to come out in the 2000s. This is a guy just in his garage putting something together in a toolbox. But you can see the speaker on the front. There's an attached strobe light that comes up onto the side. And to look at the innards of it, my favorite piece about this one is that there's a car stereo in there that actually has a tape deck in it. And in the more recent one, you can see that there's a receiver there, which picks up the radio frequency of the wolf. And so the challenges with the boxes that we have had in the past, one of the primary ones has been reliability, and that's been the case for years. So these boxes are really challenging to set up. There's about an 18-step process to try to get the box to work, and then it's really hard to tell whether or not it's working because there's no lights or anything showing you that it's on. And so because of that complex setup, it's really prone to user error. You have to be pretty savvy electronically to even get it to work. And then it's also prone to malfunction because it relies so heavily on radio frequencies. And so if you put it close to an electric fence or underneath a power line, that can trigger the box. And so it can go off when you don't want it to. And anytime we use an unreliable non-lethal tool, there's implications, not only for having predators like wolves habituate to having that device on the landscape, and then they realize that it's not actually going to do anything to them, and so it doesn't work anymore. But it also means that when we're working with livestock producers, if they start to think that this device doesn't work, then suddenly that means that all non-lethal tools don't work and they don't want to use them anymore, and they just want to see wolves lethally removed. And so it's really important that we're using these non-lethal tools in the correct circumstances, and that they're used and that they're reliable. In terms of security, there's been challenges with protecting those sensitive radio collar frequencies. So there's a specific, just like on your car radio, when you tune into a radio station, the wolf collar works exactly the same way. And so if somebody else that wants to hurt wolves gets a hold of that frequency, then they can potentially go and find that wolf and maybe even the pack and kill them. And so we want to make sure that while these boxes are being used, the people that could have access to them cannot access that radio frequency. which is, like I said, the most recent version is right there on that screen. And this one, they did find a way to be able to scramble that so that nobody could access it, but it's still a little bit too easy to get access to that. And so we wanted to address that. The third one was cost effectiveness. There's nobody in the US that is actually manufacturing rag boxes. There's no company doing so right now. It's all just guys in their garage. And so they can be expensive, and there's a really wide variety in price range, anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000, depending on who's making them and what parts they used. And so we're interested in making a cost-effective device and standardizing that pay scale. And the last piece on standardization, as I just mentioned, is that those designs vary by manufacturer, which means the reliability can vary. And there has been, up till now, no recorded schematic. So if there's no schematic or baseline for a non-lethal tool, then it makes it even more challenging for us to innovate it. And so these were all the pieces that we were looking to address. And here's, I just want to tell you the story of even how this project came about, because it was pretty cool. So about this time last year, within a 2-week period, 3 different state agencies, Washington, Oregon, and California, all happened to reach out to me independently and say, hey, we really need rag boxes. Do you have any, or do you know where we could get some? And in that same conversation, they were saying to me, oh, and also the ones we have don't really work that well. And so, that led us to just say, okay, well, if we're going to pay somebody to create some more rag boxes, then we might as well work on the design while we're going to do that, which means that we needed an engineer. And so the following week, I was headed out into the field. Defenders also has a electric fencing incentive program for bear-related conflicts. And so I was heading out to check on one of those electric fences. And I met this crazy guy in the second panel here, who I came to his house. He had this beautiful electric fence set up, and he told me all the tweaks and improvements that he made to the design that we had recommended to him. And then he gave me a 3-page report with pictures and schematics about how we could use that in the future. And I said, oh, this is fascinating. So what do you do? And he said, well, I'm an engineer. And I said, are you interested in working on this project? And he said, well, I don't know anything about wolves, but sure. And so he got one of his software developer buddies on board, and we all sat down. So the 3 state agencies, myself, and the engineer and software developer, around last September, October timeframe. And we started talking about developing the goals, like I just showed you in the first slide, prioritizing what functions this box needed to have, and putting together a development plan and timeline. And then I had the great fortune of reaching out to the Pacific Wolf Coalition, which is a great group of environmental and conservation groups here on the West Coast that work towards wolf recovery, supporting wolf recovery. And I said, we're really interested in innovating the rag box, but we need some money to develop the prototype. And they were generous enough to give us funds to be able to develop the prototype, even though the engineer and software developer are currently working pro bono. And so that led to a lot of situations like this. Obviously, during COVID, we met weekly or monthly or bi-monthly via Zoom. And it was a lot of early mornings with Lynn, the engineer, showing us the latest and greatest of his prototype development, and us talking back and forth about what features we'd like to see. And so what we were able to come up with, and some of this is still in the works, but in terms of addressing reliability, we were able to create a user-friendly setup that I'll show you shortly. The software developer very recently came up with an algorithm to reduce radio noise. There's now a data log internally to document the triggers. So to document not only when the box goes off, but also when a wolf caller actually triggers the box to go off. And so that we can print out an Excel spreadsheet that's going to show us when the box went off, when it was triggered by a wolf, and what wolf triggered it. In terms of security, there's now password protected access to get to the device setup which means inputting the collar frequencies and then also to export that data log. So the box itself actually has built-in Wi-Fi that you have to log into and have the password for in order to access all of the setup and export components. So there's nothing on the box itself that could show you the radio frequency of the wolf. In terms of cost effectiveness, we're developing a tiered pricing structure that's going to have customizable options for if you want an internal battery or to be able to use it with a solar charger, for example. And then for standardization, again, there's an open source schematic that's going to come out with it. And in terms of innovation, we were able to add on to the scare device component a notification system that I'll show you shortly. And so that's a radio that is, so when the rag box itself is triggered, it talks to the radio, which could be sitting on the bedside table of a rancher or with a conservation practitioner or with a range rider. And it's going to say, alert, alert, the rag box was just triggered. So please go out there and provide some active human presence because there's potentially a conflict happening right now. And so here's some cool video of the first prototype. This is the outside, so you can see the two lights on the sides, the speaker in the middle. There's the radio, and there's also the speakers and the lights are on the other side as well. This is just a large Pelican case that's waterproof. And there's opportunities to lock the box on both sides here with those holes. And here's the inside. Let me just stop it here. Sorry about that. So there's a volume control here, which may sound like not a big deal, but that's never been incorporated before. So it's really great to be able to test it and not blow out your eardrums. All of this will be on the inside on a final box, but it's really easy setup. So you can open it up, you can turn it on. There's a blinking light that you can use the self-test to show you that it's working and that it blinks a certain number of times. It's a threshold distance that you set the collar to trigger at, so you know it's connected to the computer. And there's also an opportunity to test the battery, which hasn't been incorporated before. And so here's an example of the notification system. I'll turn up my volume a little bit so you can hear it. So the box just went off. You can see it blinking in my car.
Alert, alert on Tuesday, April 20, 2021 at 2:25 p.m. Wolfman Jack was detected. Alert, alert, end of.
And so this was the first prototype that we brought out to test in Enterprise, Oregon with the ODFW wolf biologists. And you can see the engineers have a big sense of humor. They put Wolfie Wolfie on the screen here. And they had a British accent essentially say, alert, alert, Wolfman Jack. You can name the wolves on the computer. It says Wolfman Jack just came here at this date and this time. You know, so get out there. So we're changing it so that the accent is not British, it's going to be more American, but that will just give you a general idea of what the notification system will do when it's triggered. And so here's some other photos from the prototype test that we did this spring. We essentially tested it in multiple field conditions, and we tested all components, including the computer, and attaching it to multiple wolf collars and testing different distances. And so then we brought all of that information back to the engineer and the software developer, and they worked on tweaking some of our some pieces based off of our recommendations. And so next steps, in August of 2021, so by the end of this month, the engineers are finishing the second round of software and electrical updates. And so we're really hoping that next month we can do the second round of field testing, both in Washington and Oregon with those state agencies. And then really hoping that fall and winter of 2021, we can have the final model in production. It's initially going to be produced by the engineer that we have in Washington right now. And really hoping that winter of 2021 through 2023, we can do some really intentional treatment control studies in the Western United States. And so I submitted an application for the Christine Stevens Wildlife Award through the Animal Welfare Institute. We're hoping to hear back shortly about whether or not we've received that to be able to do a good job empirically in testing this new updated non-lethal tool. And looking into the future, so I envision a future where we don't have to have as many or any radio collars on wildlife. They've been so helpful to help us learn about wolf biology and understand their movements and activities up to this date. But there's a huge impact on those animals through trapping and collaring them. And so I'm really interested, and not only that, but usually there's only 1 to 2 wolves in a pack that are collared. So the rag box is only going to work in situations where you have collared wolves, and there's going to be less and less of them in the population as that population grows. And so for future iterations, I'm really interested in moving towards something that doesn't need a radio collar. And there's work being done in Africa and on other continents using thermal imaging technology to cameras to try to identify predators versus prey. And it's currently being done with for lion and rhino conservation in different parts of Africa. And so I think it would be really great if we could look into putting some kind of thermal imaging camera on here that would be able to identify a wolf and trigger the box that way in the future. And the last thing I wanted to say on this piece is that, you know, I just spent a lot of time talking about technological innovation, but I want to be clear that I do not think technology is always the solution. And in fact, I think many times it hinders us because we focus so much on creating these technologies and not being in relationship with the natural world and feeling the pulse of what's happening on the ground with predators and prey. And so I always promote using technology as a conservation aid, but really we're not going to tech ourselves out of this one. Really living with wolves has so much to do with returning to ancient practices, having livestock producers return to ancient grazing practices and strategic holistic livestock management that's going to support the use of these non-lethal tools. And also ensuring that there's people on the ground that know about wolves, that know about livestock, and that have the opportunity to really understand what's happening in relationship there, so that we can not only work towards additional innovative solutions to reducing human-wildlife conflict, but also so that we're in constant communication with these communities. Because as everybody's aware, coexistence is all about social relationships and cultural shifts, both in their mindset and in the actions that we want and need people to take. And so that's my piece on technology not being the solution. And lastly, I just wanted to thank all of the different partners that have been involved in this project. And I'd like to make a note that it's not often that all of our names are on this screen. All of our logos are here in a collaborative way. And so it's been a really inspiring project to be able to work with 3 different state wildlife agencies and the Pacific Wolf Coalition, along with defenders, obviously, and our pro bono engineer and software developer, to all put our heads together and come up with something that we would never have come up with alone. And I look forward to hopefully adding the Animal Welfare Institute to this list too. And with that, I'll just leave you with some more Defenders resources. If you're interested in learning more about the work we do, you can go to our coexistence story map. And please, please, please visit and sign our petition to restore federal ESA protections for wolves. It sounds like you guys will be sharing these action alerts as well. And if you have any other questions or would like to be on a list of people that are interested in knowing when these rag boxes are ready to purchase, feel free to email me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Zoe. It's always awesome to hear what you're working on in the Northwest, and it's very impressive. So thank you so much for sharing with us your work today. I do have a couple of questions that I would love to ask you. So are these rag boxes being advertised as predator detractants or marketed as something else?
Yeah, they're going to be marketed as a predator deterrent, as a non-lethal tool. They're not only going to be marketed towards wolves because they can be effective for small pastures for anything from cougars to bears to coyotes as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know that you shared a little bit of the timeline, but when do you predict this project will be available for broad distribution or for government agencies to test out the standardized prototype?
Yeah, so our timeline has been extended multiple times, which is now why I'm not giving a specific date. I'm okay with that. We're working with people pro bono that have other priorities too. But I am really hoping that by December of this year, this is going to be fully ready to produce and that we can have them in the field being tested and on the landscape by the 2022 calving season.
Awesome. Are there specific ranchers and farmers who've reached out to have these prototypes, or will they be in high corridor areas?
Yeah, there's, well, we've mostly been in conversation with different state agencies and also wildlife services staff. There's definitely ranchers that are interested. It sounds like there's going to be at least 30 to 40 boxes that are going to be in demand right from the start. And so it looks like they'll be out on the landscape pretty shortly.
How far can the radio be from the rag box to be able to receive the notification?
Yeah, so we haven't tested it most recently, but they're claiming that now it's going to work up to a few miles. And so that would be really great. And give us the opportunity to have those boxes not only on small calving pastures that are right next to human habitation, but also a little bit further away, some pastures that are out next to forested areas as well. And so we'll test the notification system in the next few months, but hopefully it'll work out to a few miles.
That's awesome. Thank you. And then a question from Diana Tomback. What is the cost looking like to power a rag box?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's going to depend on where it's placed. So right now, the rag box has an internal battery that would probably, depending on how much it went off, probably last only a week or two. But it also has external plugs that can either go to an AC wall adapter, so you could plug it into a barn with an extension cord, but it can also be plugged into a car battery or a solar panel as well. And so obviously the solar panel option, if you've got good sun, could keep you going for quite a few months.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I have, is Defenders working to support those using rag boxes with education resources for their communities? Are those resources on your website for general public?
We are always working on updating those resources. So we have a Living with Wolves document that's a few years old that talks about all different non-lethal tools and strategies, but we will definitely be putting out some rag box specific recommendations with this box as well when we go out and work with producers.
Awesome. Can you speak a little bit about how those radio collars impact wolves, just as a little background to that, kind of mentioning what you were talking about, is technology not always being the answer, but working with what we have right now?
Yeah. So those collars, like I said, as an ecologist, they've been incredibly helpful with helping us learn so much about wolf behavior. However, there's an impact on the animal. So those animals are usually either caught with a helicopter and then they're darted with a tranquilizer and then the collars put on them, or they're caught in a soft catch foothold trap that's padded. And so that's obviously very stressful for the animal. They get over it, but it's incredibly stressful for that time frame. And then after that collar's put on, the animal wakes up, everybody backs off, the animal goes off. And now there's the opportunity for, there's a trigger that can go off so that you can time that collar is only going to stay on for 6 months or a year. And then it will actually release itself, and then biologists can go and pick it up. And so that animal does not have to carry that burden around for the rest of its life. That was not always the case, and not all collars still work that way. But yeah, there's just always an issue with the collar being heavy and chafing. It's only supposed to be less than 3% of their body weight, and it normally is. But it's not great to see animals running around in the woods with those collars on, especially when they're on for their entire lives.
Thank you for speaking to that, Zoe. Appreciate it. From Shauna, how are ranchers in terms of their receptiveness to these types of developing technologies in your experience?
It's across the spectrum. So there's some people that are clamoring and really interested in trying new things, partially because they're interested in the technology piece, but many of them are also really interested in actually reducing conflicts and feeling like they're empowered to live with wolves. So that's often the conversations I have with people. That's what it's so much about. You know, we're really unlikely to get the ranching community in love with wolves. But the opportunity to show them that they actually can live with wolves, which has happened many times, just not enough, is really what we're going for here. And so being able to reach out to them and say like, hey, look at this thing that can work. And they say, oh yeah, that did work. And then they feel a lot better about having wolves on the landscape. But then obviously there's the flip side of people that just on principle are never going to use non-lethal tools, are never going to receive compensation when they have livestock losses to wolves, just out of principle because they don't want wolves on the landscape. And so those are the people that we can't necessarily work with on the ground, but can be impacted by policy, both at the federal and the state level, to say, well, you know what, we're actually mandating to some extent that you need to use non-lethal tools because wolves are here and we're recovering this native species on the landscape.
Great answer. Thanks, Zoe. A really good question from Joni. Will there be financial help for ranchers to use the rag box, kind of like the incentive program?
Yeah, that's a good question. It won't come in the same, well, actually, that's not true. So yes, and it's going to be in a few different ways. So right now, rag boxes are primarily purchased by state agencies. And so they will put down that upfront cost. And then if a rancher is having conflicts with wolves, they will go in and install the rag box, and it will be at no cost to the rancher. It will just be there during the time frame where they're having an issue, and then it will be taken and moved to a different location. So the rancher won't necessarily own that piece of equipment. And that's actually the best way for that to work, because the rancher is going to need to work with the state agency to get the rag box to work anyway, because they don't have access to the radio collar. And so it's actually better for the state agencies to own that equipment and then go and put it out where it's needed. However, there's also state-based, through depredation and compensation grant programs, there's opportunities for producers to get reimbursed or apply for funds for a variety of non-lethal tools, such as range riding, flattery, rag boxes, fox lights, etc. But many times those devices are going to come from organizations like Defenders or the state agencies themselves.
Awesome. And speaking of agencies, has anyone reached out besides those partners that you mentioned about these rag boxes widely beyond Washington, Oregon, California? Has there been any more interest, maybe in like Wisconsin and the Northern Rockies or anything along those lines?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we've definitely been working closely with the NRCS, the research branch of Wildlife Services. They're doing some non-lethal studies right now, and they are interested in testing and using rag boxes. But we're also talking with the folks through our Defender staff in the Southwest, but for Mexican gray wolf recovery. And if there are any contacts, I don't have contacts right now for Wisconsin, but I'd be happy to talk with those folks in other regions across the US as well.
Awesome. And then this is, let me try to synthesize this question. Is Defenders or other groups that you know of working to change Forest Service grazing management and cattle out of areas that are good wolf habitat, or any coexistence measurements that are happening there?
Short answer, yes. And a lot of groups are going about this a variety of different ways. But yes, Defenders is working. I'm specifically working with the Region 6 project manager to try to get adaptive management practices written into grazing plans on federal lands. So that's one avenue to do it. That's a coexistence avenue. But the Forest Service needs to pick up on this, and they need to be more supportive. There are some forests in Oregon actually that are doing a great job of allowing producers to shift their grazing practices and what pastures they're going to use, and also promoting and even buying themselves. The Forest Service has used some of their funds to purchase things like night pens for sheep and put them out on the landscape, but that's still too few and far between, and it needs to be adopted more widely.
Thank you, Zoe. And I have a question. It's two questions merged into one. Is there a cost estimate you feel comfortable sharing? We are pending NPO that is actively interested in non-lethal tools and assisting ranchers in the implementation of non-lethal measures. If not, then this person can email you and reach out that way.
Yeah, email and reach out. I mean, whatever I say is going to be wrong, but I'm hoping it's going to be somewhere between 2,500. The tiered price structure will between 2,500 and 4,000, depending on how many bells and whistles you get onto it. But hopefully somewhere in there, around the 3,000 mark.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zoe. I am just looking to see if there are any more questions. I think that those are all the questions that we have right now, Zoe. Oh, actually, there's one more. Is it easier to work with the Forest Service than the BLM because there are livestock on BLM?
There are livestock on BLM, but right now I don't work heavily with BLM because there's not much BLM land in Washington, and the abundant land in Oregon doesn't have wolves there yet. So I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I would assume that working with BLM would be equally as challenging, if not more challenging, than working with the Forest Service.
Got it. We're just waiting for, I'm seeing the typing happening as as we're chatting, so just one moment. And I'm unfamiliar with this term, and I'll be completely transparent with that. Someone asked, could wolves be tagged by RFID, much less invasive than collars?
Yeah, they could, but the process to catch them remains the same. And so you would still have to tranquilizer them from a helicopter or catch them in a foothold trap to be able to even get the RFID on them. But we are doing I'm interested in moving forward with RFID tags on cattle. There's a lot of people I know on the call today that are interested on that too. And so that's really an opportunity to be able to track cows across the landscape, understand where there's issues, make sure that there's human presence in specific areas, and be able to address conflicts as or before they arise. And so that's something that I think is coming down the pike in terms of technological advances.
Awesome. And a quick question for me too is, you mentioned the use of what is it? Not radio, what they're doing in Africa with the thermo technology. What is stopping us in the United States from using that?
Oh, I don't know if there could be people in the US that are using it. I just know it's being used most effectively and widely in Africa right now. I guess I could speculate that there's probably, personal like infringement. People would say you're just monitoring me in the US. So I feel like we have more issues with people thinking you're spying on them all the time here. So we might need to work on that a little bit, but and there's people in Germany that I think are using it too, but I'm not sure. There could be examples that other people know of how it's being used more widely in the US already.
Awesome, thank you for that, Zoe. And I believe that is it. Those are all the questions that we have right now, unless I see some typing happening, but checking with Amanda, I don't believe that there are any more. So thank you so much for your time, Zoe. We really appreciate having you here. And once again, everyone who wants to reach out to Zoe with any further questions, her contact information is on the screen. Zoe, do you have any parting words?
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. I really appreciate the work that everybody does here. And I know that there's a lot of people I work with regularly here. So it's good to see you and at least be with you virtually today.